Okay, let's get started. So welcome to day 2 of academic network conference for the PI. We're very excited to kick off this day 2 with a session on governance and incentives. Again, I wanted to thank our co-chairs, Caroline Flammer, Ayako Yasuda, and our missing co-chair, but very important, also the chair of the Academic Network Committee, Laura Starks, who couldn't be with us today. And more importantly, the people who are actually doing the work. So Catherine, again, you'll be thanked at every single instance. What best to start today with the award-winning paper. So, very thankful. The paper is also set in Japan, so it will be a great illustration of academic research done on a very topical issue here in the local market. So I will now introduce Marco Becht from Université Libre de Bruxelles, and also his co-authors are in the room, all 4 of them. So also lucky to have Kazunori or Suzuki, who is local. There's also Hideki Mijaima and Julian Franks also in the audience. So this couldn't be a better start for the day. And the paper is thus paying passive managers to engage, improve ESG performance.
Good morning. Thank you for coming. First of all, we'd like to thank Caroline, Pedro, Ayako, and Laura, who's not here, for including our paper. We were already excited when our paper was chosen, but we are all the more excited now and honored to be chosen as the best paper of this conference. So this is a joint work with Marco Becht, Julian Franks, Hideaki Miyajima, and me. This is about the natural experiment of GPIF, Japanese pension fund, public pension fund, which started in 2017. GPIF is, GPIF is the largest asset owner around the world, whose asset under management is around $2 trillion. It's a universal owner, and asset management is its unique feature is that its asset management are fully outsourced. They don't invest on their own, but they only have hire the outside managers. The GPIF is PRI and Japanese Stewardship Code signatory. The unique feature that we focus on is this GPIF's ESG enhancement program, which had 2 important pillars. The first is to create tilted index and shift part of their passive portfolio to these so-called tilted passive index. Okay, so to incentivize the companies to improve their ESG scores to be included in the index. The second pillar is this ESG enhancement asset management program, to which they chose actually 2 asset managers and paid extra fees to get engaged with the companies that they invest. These 2 pillars are important and interesting subject for academic research. The first one is about this tilted index effectiveness. The previous research shows that the tilted index inclusion-exclusion does not have significant impact on the share prices of the companies involved. But we find the evidence to the contrary. The second point is about this paying passive managers. The passive managers have been criticized for free riding other people's engagement efforts by not paying, because they are not incentivized because they want to track the index. The GPIF's effort to pay some extra fees to selected asset managers may be a solution for this kind of free riding problem. So these are the 2 pillars that we are interested. Let's see. So the first pillar is this indices. They created so-called tilted index, best-in-class indices. One is from FTSE Blossom Japan Index, and the other is MSCI Japan ESG Select Leaders Index. They are both leaders index in the definition, which means that only the companies which meet inclusion criteria are included in the index. So this, I guess, incentivized the companies to enhance their ESG scores, which the criteria of these indices are based on FTSE, in the case of FTSE's ESG scores, and MSCI ESG scores. So we hypothesize that it may give some additional incentive for the companies to improve ESG. And that's what GPIF's intention was. On the second side of this paid engagement program, GPIF adopted in 2018 2 asset managers and paid extra fees. Apart from those normal asset management fees, this is more like a flat fee for engaging with the companies that they invest. So there are 20 ESG issues from this. This is okay. I forgot to mention this one of these 2 selected manager is Asset Management One. Asset Management One is the largest passive equity investment asset manager of GPIF. So we were lucky to have the people who are here to obtain proprietary information of their engagement records, 3,700 something. So that's an enormous record, and they have all the themes, E, S, and G, and ESG. ESG is more like a crossover themes. They split up into smaller details of 20 ESG issues. And then they had this milestone assessment program from the scale of 1 to 8. 1 is the start and 8 is the completion. So we have all the records between 2018 and 2022 for these over 3,000 meetings with 527 invested companies. So that's how we are going to analyze, and then we are going to relate the improvement or change of ESG scores of FTSE and MSCI. I'll pass on to Marco for the detailed explanation about what we have done.
So what we were looking for is when the engagement program came in 2018, does that have an impact on scores? So if you look at the purple line, you see a kink, and this is exactly what we would look for. The treatment comes in, and then there's a kink in the scores. Now, there's a problem, though, because as Ika explained to you, the index adoption came in about at the same time. So if we find a kink, is that due to engagement, or is that because of the incentives created by the index? To distinguish between these 2 effects, we use a control group, and that's the people who've never been engaged. So that's the blue line. It's very similar to what Yupana explained yesterday. And then we do differences and differences. So differences before the period of engagement with afterwards. And then if we find a difference in the differences, we can be pretty confident that that is due to the engagement. And we also control for fixed effects. And that's what we do. And it turns out that for FTSE, we find an impact on E and on ESG. But for MSCI, we only find an impact on G and not on the others. Now, in the paper, you'll find more details. We also do quantile regression, so this impact is most powerful for the companies with the lowest scores. So there the response is the greatest. And then we also do something called staggered difference in differences, because the treatment didn't come in all at once, but it's actually rolled out over time. And you can find more results in there. And we also use a different treatment group than not yet treated as opposed to those who've never been treated. But I'll leave that for you to read the paper for those details. The puzzle then was, why is FTSE so different from MSCI, right? Because it's the same engagement. So why does FTSE look so different? from MSCI. And we then did a deep dive into FTSE and MSCI scores. You can see Iko still has his hair. It had a different result on me. So we did this deep dive, and it actually turns out that the details here really matter. So I'll just give you two of these details. When the company doesn't report, for MSCI, that's a missing value. For FTSE, that's a 0. Now, 0 and missing values matter if you've ever calculated grade point averages. If you take a course and leave out the score, or you put in a 0, it matters for the score. So the fact that you put in a 0 really matters. And we can debate whether that's a good or a bad idea. We actually think awarding a 0 is a good idea. Now, more perplexing and more important, and we actually call this the MSCI paradox, is that MSCI adjust their materiality weights. So is something important or not important very rapidly at the company level. So here's the paradox. If you're very successful with your engagement, and the score of the ESG score goes up, the materiality of that theme in MSCI goes down, okay, because it becomes less important. So the effect disappears, so to speak. With FTSE, that's not true, because they think that, for example, a retail company, Kelley's cement company, that there's certain things in the cement sector that are high impact, that are important, okay? And that stays the same for FTSE. So FTSE scores in that sense are much more usable for assessing engagement. Now, we then checked for the index inclusion effect, and you know the result from Berg and van Binsbergen. They find nothing for the US. We actually find a very large, a very substantial effect for Japan. And our interpretation is simple. If you don't invest much in an index, there's not much of a demand shock. The largest pension fund in the world invests substantial amounts on this, and you get a pop up and down. So there is a very substantial financial incentive to do this. We then check against the rest of the world, so the overall program, because we don't have a control group in Japan, and the result is that Japan actually, during that period, has caught up very much in terms of FTSE scores to the rest of the world. Now, what's our punchline? I think Berg van Binsbergen, for example, say that, well, leader indices don't work. You should do engagement. What we find is that you can actually very well combine leader indices with engagement. And what you should really do is engage with the companies that have the lowest scores and the highest materiality, and then they have an incentive to be included in an index. And then to, again, speak to Kelly's example, Martin Marietta wouldn't be forgotten. They'd be kicked out of the index and engaged. And then, like if they repent, they can come back into the fold or not, okay? So anyway, I could go on talking for another 10 minutes, but that would, break the rules, and I'm already over time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marco. So let me invite, so the format is we'll have an academic discussion and practitioner discussion, but again, invite everyone. The papers are available online and you can take a deeper dive. So first we'll hear from Junyang from Indiana University.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Caroline, Ayako, and Pedro for inviting me to discuss the paper. It's a great presentation. I like the paper a lot. So this is about the government pension investment funds and their initiative to use AM1, asset management with a remunerated mandate to talk with portfolio companies. And they're measuring ESG performance. The measures are the ESG scores by FTSE and MSCI. The analysis is very carefully done. It's a diff-in-diff analysis with dynamic analysis as well as cohort analysis. What Marco and his co-authors find is the ESG scores improves for FTSE, especially at the bottom decile. And more specifically, this result comes from the E score. And for MSCI, there is improvement only in the category of G score. And the results, if you look into the tables very carefully, cross-checking like 200 numbers, you're going to find most of the results are coming from engagements occurred in 2018 and 2019. The effect takes time and actually lasts for at least 3 years after the engagement. So that's the main results. There are additional results about index exclusion and inclusion for both the MSCI and the FTSE index. And Marco presented slightly differently. In the paper, initially, they do find a very nice trend, but they stated the results for MSCI is very significant, and for FTSE, it's a little bit hard to tell, so I'm going to comment on that. First of all, I really want to say congratulations. It's a wonderful paper, but I also think personally, you are a little bit understudying the paper, so that's my first comment. And that's on the event study. And the second one is about the measures of engagement. And this is a question to all the ESG rating agencies. I know some of you are in the audience. And the last one is ESG scores versus ESG performance. I don't think they are exactly the same thing. So first of all, event studies. Many of us, if you're in academia, we do event studies, and date 0 is critical. Date 0 is when the public learn about the information, when the investors learn about particular news, and that's the announcement date of index inclusion or exclusion. So currently, the co-authors are using the effective date as the event date, which is 9 business days later. So what would that affect the results? So this is where I believe they're underselling the results. So right now, day 0 is 9 days after all the announcement. If you moved it back by 9 days and relabel -9 as 0, as you can see, the trends are a lot more clear from 5 days before that, which is -14 day, to 5 days after that, you see a very clear increasing trend, and it's more precise increasing trend. So if you use this approach, you move the date 0 to the announcement date, then the FTSE Blossom Index inclusion and exclusion both are significant. So why would this make any difference? If you are in the industry, you can ignore this. But essentially, you are narrowing down the event window from their original 21 days to 11 days. So this would make the abnormal return measured over a more precise area. So the standard error is small. So essentially that increases your statistical significance substantially. The t-stats goes up by 1.38 times. So now I can rewrite their conclusion on the index inclusion part to say, a FTSE Blossom Index impact overall, as well as the topics mid-cap 400, as well as the small cap returns. So you have large positive announcement returns. And on the exclusion side, even though there's a very small sample, only 20 exclusions, there's a substantial result, a very negative normal return for the FTSE Blossom Index exclusion. Similarly, for MSCI index inclusion, you have large result for the overall, for the mid-cap, as well as for the small cap, for the market adjustment model. And exclusion has very large impact, even for the topics 100 largest companies. So this is a very strong result. For the MSCI, it's very similar. If you move the event date by 9 days, it's very clean results. You have both economic significance and statistical significance. I think the author has a much stronger result than what they presented in the paper. This is really, you find some market impact of these index inclusion and exclusions, not only among the smallest company, but also the mid-cap. And for MSCI, actually, you have the results for the large cap as well. The second question is about measures of ESG impact. There's an academic paper by Berg et al. In 2022 about review of finance. They're comparing the divergence of 6 prominent ESG readers. There's low correlations among them. One of the 6 ESG reader is MSCI, and there are different reasons. Different weighting scheme seems only to contribute 6% of the divergence. So the next question I have is, the authors are using FTSE and MSCI, and for FTSE, the weight seems to be relatively constant. If you increase the score with constant weight, you can see an improving overall rating for E and for the ESG overall score. For MSCI, I don't know who here is from MSCI. I'm pleading, could you make your materiality weighting scheme, the algorithm, more transparent? Because the algorithm is adjusting over time. With the two cases Marco and his co-authors analyzed, it seems that the weight of E and S were going down and the weight for G is going up over this engagement period, because all three dimensions, the scores are improving, but the G weight goes up. That's where you see the results from the G aspect, but not from the E and S. So here I want to know whether the rating agencies can make your algorithm more transparent so academic and whoever is serious about this topic can know what we can conclude from our results. So here is the next slide. I think this is for both academic scholars and practitioners, the real impact of impact investing. So which ESG ratings to use? There are 6 of them, or there's more. I saw Fitch yesterday. And because they have very low correlations, right? So can you provide your index to more scholars so we can use multiple of them? And the second thing is, are ESG scores the same as ESG performance? Excuse me, I don't think so. So let me give you a nuanced example. For example, usually in the S category, charitable donations are rated as good. If you have charitable donations from the company, you have a higher S score. But there are at least several papers, including my own paper, documenting that if company donations go to charities, sometimes it's at the cost of shareholders, especially if corporate donations go to charities affiliated with their independent directors. What a surprise. So when you have a higher S score, you are probably damaging your G score at the same time. So this is not very clear which score you should look at. Is that S or G? How do you weight these two scores? So I think ESG performance is not precisely measured by one ESG score. And the next question is, do companies really improve their other decisions, real decisions besides disclosure? And here I'm quoting our session chair, Pedro's paper, do responsible investors invest responsibly? I think that's a great question. So here as an ad, I have a QR code here. You can get your equipment out. So I'm running the Kelley Institute for Corporate Governance. I'm open to work with any practitioners here. And Marco and I, Marco is representing the ECGI, we're co-hosting a whole series of public lectures. On December 7th, our session chair, Pedro, is going to give a public lecture on greenwashing and ESG investing as a crossroads. I think that's a very important discussion. Perhaps all of us should be interested, and you are more than welcome to participate. I know the time is not super friendly. Actually, I'm hosting shareholder voting at 1 a.m. tomorrow morning. That's the Asian time. So if you're interested in attending the shareholder voting one, come to see me afterwards. Other than that, it's very great paper, well done, and congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you. And I appreciate the marketing, the advertising. So cross-advertising between. So our next discussant is Briere from Amundi, and she'll give us a practitioner perspective on the paper.
So thanks a lot, Pedro. Thanks. I would like to thank the organizers, Caroline for sure, Catherine, for having me in the program. So it's a great pleasure to discuss this paper, and I would also like to congratulate the authors for the prize. And I had a great pleasure reading this paper, which is very interesting and on a very important question. So engagement is very important. And here I'm also advertising Pedro's paper because I take this picture, this graph from one of your recent papers. Institutional investors are increasingly engaging with companies on ESG issues. And it's basically the favorite ESG strategy by PRI signatories. 86% of them are doing engagement. So it's becoming very, very important in the ESG space. So then that raises some questions, of course. And the first question is, how effective is engagement? And if you look at the academic literature, indeed, we don't have so many proofs that engagement matters and that it has a real impact on companies. The reason for that is that the data on private engagement is very challenging to access. And of course, you were very lucky to be able to access GPAF data. So there are some papers on active managers and showing that successful engagement is followed by abnormal returns. There are a couple of papers by Dimson and co-authors. Also, a more recent paper by Bauer and co-authors showing that it also improves the environmental performance, but in particular, and in the paper, only for material engagement. So I think that's something which is quite important. But that's for active managers. So if we look now at passive managers, which is the focus of your paper, we have this famous paper by Azar and co-authors looking at the big three, so the main asset managers in the US, so BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. And they show that there is a negative association between the the ownership and the carbon emission. But it's not a proof that engagement matters and has an impact. It's just an association. All right. So first question, is it effective? Second question, which is very important for practitioners, how to make engagement effective? And here we have a lot of questions. Some of them are addressed in the papers, but there are much more than this. So for me, the paper also raised a number of important questions that I think we should tackle as practitioners, but also academics should probably look more into these questions. So first question is, do asset managers have the right incentives to engage companies? And as you rightly stress in the paper, there might be a conflict of interest. Engagement is costly, and passive asset managers might have no incentive to engage. Then you can remunerate for that, right? And GPAF took this unique opportunity to engage some of their asset managers to do that. But then that raises also many other questions. What the optimal remuneration structure, right? Should it be a fixed fee? So now you say that it seems to be fixed. I didn't find that in the paper. Should it depend on achievement? I see pros and cons for both, right? Because depending on achievement might also incentivize the asset manager to do quick wins, right? You focus on companies where they know that it will be very easy to achieve some engagement results. And then the last set of questions I have, also connected with your paper, is how to improve efficiency. I mean, GPIF seems to have combined engagement with these nice benchmarking on ESG indices. So it's a combination, in my view, of engagement plus this inclusion-exclusion policy. So with the idea that it might incentivize companies to do better if they want to be included in the ESG index. But is it the best way to combine? I mean, a lot of other asset managers are combining private engagement with public engagement, right? With voting at general meeting, even sometimes filing some shareholder resolutions. What's the most efficient? So that leads me to my more precise questions about your paper. My first question is about the treatment. And I was a little bit concerned, I mean, having some discussions with people doing real engagement in the industry about the exogeneity of the treatment, right? In my view, there might be some potential endogeneity issue, because you don't know how AM1 chose a company to engage, right? And maybe these were firms with the highest probability of engagement success. So why would they spend time and effort, engaging companies where they know there will never be any result? Probably they didn't do that, right? And I know that people doing engagement have a tendency to focus on the companies that are on the path of improving in a way. So you see that you show that there is no pre-trend, and you say it's a kind of proof that it's exogenous, but in my view, it's not proving anything, because there could be no pre-trend, but the companies could be in a better position to improve, right? And then I had a couple of questions on the control group you should use. And in my view, I think you could do even much more than this, maybe several papers out of the experiment, depending on the control book you're looking, because there are many very interesting questions you could tackle with your data set. So now you're looking at this bundled strategy where there is engagement, plus there is the ESG benchmarking, so creating this incentive for companies to be included in the index. But you could also look at companies engaged by AM1 that was remunerated versus companies other other asset managers that were not remunerated. And then you could look at the impact of being remunerated as an asset manager on engagement. You could also look at companies close to index inclusion or exclusion to companies that were far away from that inclusion exclusion to see if it's a combination with the ESG benchmark, which is what is mattering. So I think there are several things you could add, maybe for other papers, but that could make the results very interesting for practitioners. I add, like you, some questions, of course, on the ESG performance. I mean, it's very striking, but we know about the aggregate confusion and all that, so that the ESG ratings differ. So no surprise in your results that you find different results depending on the rating agency, and you give convincing explanations for that. But maybe you should look more into disaggregated scores, like the 30 MSCI issue scores. You could also look at the most and least material issues and see if there are differences here. You could redo the exercise while keeping the MSCI subweights fixed to get a better comparison with FTSE. Then you would see what's coming from the subscores themselves. And you could look also at direct measures of environmental performance, like carbon emissions, carbon intensity. So these could be very nice additions to the paper. My last question is about measuring impact. And here again, I see a lot of other things you could do. So we'd like to know which type of engagement has more impact. Is it private only or private combined with public, voting at AGM? Is it single versus collaborative engagement? I know the PRI has been very influential in promoting collaborative engagement, and GPIF might do so as well. So we'd like to know what was single, what was collaborated, engagement on material issues, and also something which I think is very important in your case, because as you said, GPIF is the largest asset manager in the world. So we'd like to see if there are heterogeneous effects depending on the size of the stake in the companies. And you could certainly do that, right? Is it more efficient to do it when you're a large owner? Or could you also have some success when you have smaller stakes? And I'd like just to finish in 1 minute. So impact on financial performance is something you could look at as well, right? And lastly, maybe also some spillover effect, right? I think this was mentioned also by Yoon, that you could engage on S issue and have an impact on the environmental score. And some of these engagements are sometimes bundled. So I think that looking at the spillover effects on the other dimensions of the rating could be something that is important to look at. So just to conclude, lessons, I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from your paper for practitioners. It's a unique experiment. It's a really great paper. So I really encourage everyone to read it. So do we have the answers to my two initial questions? Does engagement matter? I think it's a yes, but it's a small yes, right? We are not entirely sure because of my issues on the exogeneity of the treatment and the heterogeneity you find in the result across rating providers. And how to engage efficiently, I think this is still an unresolved question that we would like to see more research about that. So there is some evidence that combined with this ESG benchmarking, it works, but the size matter, and also we would like to know more about the structure of incentives. I think that's something which is very important. Fixed versus variable fee, I mean, these are questions that would need to be addressed. So in conclusion, I think that we need additional research. So it's an open call to academics here, but also to practitioners to share their data on engagement, because we need more research on this question. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. So we're running out of time. So maybe just if you can give us a short reaction, and then we can also reserve some time at the end for the audience question.
Okay, thank you very much for all the comments. All the comments are well taken. For the audience, please, if you're interested in for us to analyze your engagement data, we are open and we are welcoming for all your. We are going to sign the contract anyway and non-disclosure. So please contact us. Thank you.
So at the larger level, what was fascinating for me about this project is that we kind of looked at this, or I looked at this for the first time from the perspective as an asset owner. I think academics, we focus too much on asset managers. We have to focus much more on the perspective of the asset owner. And the question here is, if you're the asset owner, how can you really design a program to achieve maximum impact? And I think we have to stop thinking about engagement and portfolio integration and voting in silos. These things really interconnect. And the program that we see at the moment is not perfect. And I was really quite struck to see that there is no product out there. There is no service provider that would actually provide asset owners with the kind of maximum impact integrated product that you really need if you want to do this. Now, the second thing that this requires is actually courage by the asset owners. Because if you have such a product and you could achieve impact, you might get into yesterday's panel and you get the political problems that come with that. So I think it's no coincidence that most asset owners use these weighted indices where they just tilt the weights a little bit, or they say, oh, my asset managers are doing some engagement, and engagement means they send a letter. And when you hear the fossil fuel industry saying, oh, please engage with us, I turn very skeptical. So please, asset owners, be more courageous. I think the GPIF program gives you a hint of how that could be structured in a way to achieve real impact. Thank you.
Right. Thanks very much. So let's move on to the second paper. And Xintong will be presenting. Jay co-author is also here. So we have good representation for that team. And that paper is Foreign Institutional Investors and Corporate Carbon Emissions.
All right, thanks, Pedro, and thanks for the program chairs for selecting our paper. I'm Xintong Zhan from Fudan University. So it's really a pleasure to share with the great audience about our new work, Foreign Institutional Ownership and Corporate Carbon Emission. As you say, Jay is here, and we also have two junior co-authors who are Elaine and Zoe. All right, since we are in the conference organized by the PRI, I don't think I need to convince you that there is global warming and carbon emission really matters. So what we need to do now is to really reduce carbon emission. As financial economists, right, we really care about carbon emissions by the companies. The research has shown that the companies, especially the listed companies, actually contribute to global warming emissions by 40%. So if we can actually change the companies, that is going to be a great step towards tackling the challenges related to global warming. So investors, we can indeed play a critical role in climate actions. For example, we can do the engagement and capital allocation choices. The signatories, of course, the institutions here, they are especially important to take the action, right? So the signatories of PRI will contribute to developing a more sustainable global financial system. And one way is through active ownership. So this is principle number 2. We will be active owners and incorporate ESG issues into our ownership policies and practices. So many of those practices have been mentioned in the first presentation in the discussions as well. For example, you can file shareholder resolutions consistent with long-term ESG considerations, or you can exercise the voting rights, or even monitor the compliance of the voting policies if they are outsourced. And last, you can engage with the companies on ESG issues. One of the signatories, the Rebecca, actually announced that engagement together with the threat of divestment could be the most powerful way towards its road to net zero emissions by 2050. The challenge, however, when we make the commitment and when we move from commitment to actions is to understand what are the challenges faced by active owners. So what does it take when we transform from an owner to an active owner? And this is exactly what we would like to shed light on in this paper. All right, so what we show in the paper is that ownership structures actually matters for corporate carbon emission reductions. So using a very large sample with more than 70,000 firms, from year observations from more than 10,000 firms all around the world, we actually separate foreign institutions from domestic institutions, and we find foreign institutions tend to be more effective in monitoring the firm and therefore reducing the firm's carbon emissions. Domestic institutions, however, they do not have such an effect. More specifically, we find a 1 percentage point increase in foreign institutional ownership is associated with a reduction of 0.53% in carbon intensity. So it means when a firm is held by more foreign institutions, to obtain the same level of revenue, their carbon emission actually reduce. For an average firm in our sample, it means a reduction of 9,000 tons of carbon. So why are foreign institutions a little bit different from those domestic institutions? We actually argue at least 2 unique features contribute to this active ownership by foreign institutions. First of all, foreign institutions are likely to have business ties with their local investee firms. If you think about domestic institutions, they do rely on local companies to generate business, such as underwriting. So it makes their engagement with the companies more difficult. The domestic institutions may want to change the firm, however, the firms may be reluctant to change. The lack of business ties therefore enable foreign institutions to be more effective and powerful in active ownership. Anecdotal evidence indeed shows that if you look at Fidelity, which is an US investment firm, Fidelity is more powerful on corporate governance issues in Europe, but they are less likely to do that in the US. The reason is that Fidelity manages several pension accounts for their companies, so it's quite difficult for them to engage with the firm. And research by our session chair as well as our discussant, they also show using a large sample and very scientific approach that foreign institutions tend to be more effective monitors than domestic firms. Therefore, we argue that the independence of foreign institutions are likely to contribute to their active management or active ownership in terms of the carbon emissions. And secondly, if you think about foreign institutions, they tend to be global investors. It means they are likely to have more resources and expertise. The road to net zero is not going to be easy, and decarbonization is not easy for the firms as well. It requires knowledge as well as expertise. So, research has shown that foreign institutions could bring knowledge to firms and even enhance corporate innovation. We argue in the same way. So when foreign institutions invest across the border, they also bring the decarbonization knowledge to the investee firms and therefore facilitate carbon reduction. How do we identify the role played by foreign institutions in corporate carbon emission? We are going to run a simple panel regression. So we are interested in the corporate carbon emissions directly controlled by the firm, and therefore we are going to use scope 1 carbon emission. And we are going to scale it by the revenue of the firm and further take the logarithm, natural logarithm. This is going to be our dependent variable. And our key independent variable will be foreign institutional ownership, which is measured by the percentage of a firm's market cap held by institutions that are not domiciled in the same region or country as the investee firm. And similarly, you can actually measure the domestic institutions. We control for a set of variables like size, leverage, and they do really not affect our results. So as you can see from the table, foreign institutional ownership has a significant negative impact on future corporate carbon emissions, while domestic institutions fail to do that. Are those results really related to active ownership? Yes, we find foreign institutional ownership or foreign institutions enhance managerial compensation to the sensitivity to carbon emissions. So managers are actually aligned with the shareholders in terms of reducing carbon emissions. And secondly, we do find when a firm is held by more foreign institutions, there are more proxy votes related to carbon emissions or environmental or social issues. So they actively exercise their voting rights. And last, we look at the pattern and find the results is actually driven by institutions that are more independent, longer-term oriented, and when the institutions are from countries or regions with a higher climate awareness. So those results are consistent with the unique features of foreign institutions and also validate our argument that foreign institutions are likely to be active owners. A natural question that you may have: do foreign institutions change the firm or they choose the firm? It is possible, right? So foreign institutions only focus on the firms that are likely to reduce carbon emissions in the future. Or alternatively, firms can emit less to attract foreign institutions. So we show this is not likely to be the case. Using a unique case, when the firms experience sudden, unexpected increase in foreign institutional ownership, we find there is a reduction in corporate carbon emission in the future. It means foreign institutions change the firms rather than choose the firms. So let me conclude. In the paper, we show that foreign institutions lowers carbon emission levels of their investee firms, and domestic institutions do not do that. The unique features such as independence and their international resources actually empower those foreign institutions to be effective, active owners. And our paper also has several implications. Firstly, we suggest that corporate managers could be mindful that the company could actually benefit from the foreign institutional ownership in terms of the monitoring as well as their knowledge spillover. And second, local institutions and regulators can actually leverage on the benefits from foreign institutions to take actions in climate changes and contribute to a more sustainable future. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to our discussions, comments, as well as your questions.
Thanks, Xintong. So let me invite Miguel Ferreira from Nova as the academic discussant.
Good morning. So let me first thank Pedro for the opportunity to discuss this very interesting paper. It's actually very closely related to my own work with Pedro on foreign institutional investors around the world. We already know that foreign institutional investors can promote and improve corporate governance of firms, create investment and employment, and ultimately improve firm performance. And now we also know that they can have also a positive influence in improving the environmental policies of firms and encouraging the reduction of carbon emissions. So what's the summary of the paper? So the authors find that foreign institutional ownership is associated with lower Scope 1 carbon emissions. So the effect is sizable. So one standard deviation increase in foreign institutional ownership, which is about 6 percentage points, decrease emissions by more than 3%. On the other hand, there's no effect of domestic institutional ownership on carbon emissions. So there's here a special role of foreign institutions in terms of emissions, reducing emissions. And the reason why this is the case, it's basically because foreign institutional investors are more independent from the local management because they have fewer business connections to the firm. And this is not obvious because you may think that actually domestic institutions can have a larger influence than foreigners because foreigners are more globally diversified. And because of that, they are less exposed to climate risk shocks. In terms of the mechanisms, the paper finds that the effect seems to be driven by engagement because there's more shareholder proposals on E&S when there's higher foreign institutional ownership in the firm. And there's also, it seems to be, there is a link between carbon emissions and the executive compensation in the firm. The effect is also stronger in multinational firms and in firms that are financially unconstrained, which is easy to understand. And ultimately, you may wonder is it really foreign institutions that are changing the carbon emissions of the firm, or it's just institutions that are able to anticipate and invest in firms that are going to reduce emissions in the future, and using some exogenous changes in foreign institutional ownership, such as MESCI additions or investor distraction measures, or even a diff in diff around the 2015 Paris Agreement, seem to suggest that it's really investor foreign institutions that are leading to a change and to lower carbon emissions. Okay, so what are my comments and suggestions to further improve the paper? So first, I think it's always good to do a reality check of the results in the paper. Is it plausible or not? And I think it's easy to check that it's really plausible that shareholders, large investors and large foreign investors, they are putting pressure on firms to reduce carbon emissions. If you just do a quick search of financial news, you find several news mentioning that large investors, foreign institutional investors, such as, for example, BlackRock, or other big investors, such as those in the Climate Action's 100+ initiative, are putting really pressure on firms to reduce carbon emissions. And, for example, BlackRock is voting against directors that fail to address environmental issues on firms. So my first comment, it's about an alternative channel, which is changes in capital supply. So when a firm is added to the MSCI index, there may be simultaneously a change in capital supply. There will be more capital supply to the firm, and there may be even a decrease in the cost of external finance to the capital to the firm. And firms potentially could raise more external finance and thus increase the investments to reduce carbon emissions. So it may not be necessarily the effect of institutional ownership, but it may be because of an increase in capital supply. And here, what the authors can do to address this issue is to look at changes in equity and debt issues around the time of the MSCI stock addition, and also look at internal financing by looking into cash. My second comment is about which changes in environmental policies of the firm are taking place. Are there actual changes when foreign institutional ownership increases? And how do firms exactly reduce toxic emissions? So is there a reduction in production, or there's abnormal investment, specific investment towards decreasing carbon emissions, or there's an increase in emission abatement costs and expenditures around the time of this investment by foreign institutions? The third comment is they already explore investor heterogeneity, but I think there's room to understand better investor heterogeneity of the results. I think one important dimension is the stake size. What's the stake of the foreign institutional investor in the firm? Because if your stake is higher, you have more incentives to monitor and put pressure to change, to encourage a reduction in toxic emissions. You could also look at institutional ownership concentration. When the ownership is more concentrated, there's also more incentives to put pressure. It could also be interesting to look at US versus non-US institutions, because we know that the patterns of domestic institutions in the US and outside the US are different. There's much higher institutional ownership, domestic institutional ownership in the US by US institutions. Active versus passive is also an interesting angle. There's a lot of controversy about if passive investors are good monitors and put pressure or not. They already have results on big three, but it would be also interesting to isolate passive institutions. PRI versus non-PRI institutions, also interesting. And finally, I think one very interesting potential result will be to use portfolio holdings-based measures to be better able to classify institutions having resources, knowledge, and expertise on how to accelerate the decarbonization by looking at their actual holdings on firms and if those firms are actually already decarbonizing or not. Firm heterogeneity is also an important dimension. It's already explored, but there's room also to explore more. One important comment, I think, it's to try to reconcile results with the Cheng et al. Paper. They actually find that in emerging markets, foreign institutions actually increase carbon emissions of the firms where they invest in. Also, US versus non-US firms, we know that, for example, in Europe, there's been more action in terms of improving environmental issues and reducing carbon emissions than in US firms. So that could be potentially also interesting. And finally, also explore differences, variation in corporate governance of firms in terms of board independence or diversity, or even board size. And finally, about mechanisms. So the paper provides evidence that engagement is the mechanism by which foreign institutions are able to change the firm carbon emissions. It's not selection. It's not that institutions invest in firms that they anticipate that will decarbonize. So there's evidence in the paper that salary growth is faster when emissions are lower and foreign institutions are present in that firm. I think the authors could expand the results here by also looking at total compensation and equity-based compensation instead of just focusing on fixed pay on salary. And also, it will be interesting to have more direct evidence that these shareholder proposals on E&S actually come from foreign institutions. And finally, some empirical quibbles about the paper. In particular, I think here the most important comment will be to have figures with the dynamics of the effect of foreign institutions on carbon emissions, and try to understand if this effect is persistent over time. And just to conclude, so this is a very interesting and well executed paper. It gives us new insights on shareholder activism by foreign institutions. So it expands our knowledge about what are the effects of foreign institutions on firm policies on an important aspect, which is environmental issues. And if I were the referee, I would give a revise and resubmit to the paper. Thank you very much.
Okay. Right. So, last but not least, I wanted to invite Lloyd Kurtz from Montecito as our practitioner discussing.
Thank you very much. No slides from me. I'll talk, which raises the beta considerably. Just a few minutes. Leonard Bernstein said the secret to success is to have a plan and not quite enough time. So you can grade me on my plan later. Paper's excellent. Fortunately, we've great paper and great discussant. I don't have to say very much about the finding. We can trust it. This is a good finding. The paper rewards rereading. A great deal of care was taken in the controls. The authors have anticipated some of the obvious objections. If you say, oh, you're focusing on scope 1, say, well, we looked at scope 2 and 3, it's about the same. Or if you say, well, maybe this is because foreign investors prefer the greener company. No, we looked at that and the companies are changing. So this is powerful stuff. It's a great paper. So congratulations to the authors on that. I think where the trouble starts is when you say, okay, I believe this paper. What does that mean? And I think this paper ends up lighting up a number of parallel conversations. First, I would relate it to some of the human capital work that was done yesterday. This paper illustrates the advantages we have in studying climate, that we have well-developed instruments and metrics. And so you can get a clear and fairly decisive finding on an original research question. In human capital, we're struggling. Why does that matter? When I was on the SASB technical board, we consistently polled asset owners and asked them, what are the most important things to you? Number 1 was climate. Number 2 was human capital. So in the human capital space, we have a significant analytical challenge that in climate, perhaps we are on the way to surmounting. I should add that they used the True Cost database, really the gold standard, I think, for professional investors and probably for academic practice, imperfect, but again, a well-developed, well-elaborated tool for them to start with. Next point would be that this paper has significant governance implications. And perhaps we should start with engagement. I thought Marie's comments on engagement were fantastic and saved me a minute and a half. I would add that Caroline Flammer's 2015 paper also really ignited a kind of a mini literature on engagement, which I find pretty persuasive. But if you look at those original papers, Flammer's and Dimson's, they were narrow. Dimson is focused on one asset manager. Caroline's experimental design narrows the sample to the close call resolutions, which those tend to be human capital resolutions. This paper is big. And because they've ruled out most of the other obvious mechanisms, I'm sorry, I had to write down the numbers, which I know she presented, but I think they are worth repeating. 11,379 firms, 56 countries, 19 years. That is a loud statement on the value of active ownership. The point was made earlier, Albert Hirschman, exit or voice. In the stock market, exit is virtually free. So there's a high burden on voice. Voice is expensive. It needs to work. We need to show it can work, or else the active ownership pillar of PRI is somewhat endangered conceptually. So this is a very important paper in that regard. I'd go a little bit further. There was also some talk yesterday on Political Session about Citizens United, very peculiar, perhaps unique to the US way of looking at the world, gives corporations the right to free speech and to engage politically. In a society that values free speech, it's very difficult to say no to this. One, perhaps even proponents did not anticipate where this would lead. For one thing, if you're a manager of a corporation and you have the right to participate politically, and your duty is to maximize firm value, then virtually all corporations now have a duty to engage politically. So the observation that they become more political, not all that shocking. The question is, do we have a big expropriation problem? All these companies are getting more involved politically in deploying shareholder capital. Who are they answering to? I think one interesting unintended consequence is being experienced by the state of Florida in their dispute with the Disney Corporation, where Disney is answerable to a constituency much larger and broader than the state of Florida, shareholders from around the world who subscribe to global standards. And so Disney has a difficult management problem in managed to local conditions where the local regulator is not well aligned with certain global standards. This problem will become pervasive. So with respect to climate risk, there are many jurisdictions where climate is not viewed as a significant problem, but a large multinational enterprise with a global shareholder base, ultimately, the enterprise needs to be accountable to its owners within the narrow boundaries of local regulation. We're going to have an entirely different kind of governance problem if local jurisdictions decide that they can go beyond regulation of activities and they can impose their will on corporations and force them to adopt their policy priorities. So this is, O.J. Joe at Santa Clara University made this point many years ago. ESG starts to function as a conflict resolution mechanism. Our political processes in every nation are imperfect, and certainly they're imperfect globally. The markets provide an extraordinarily comprehensive information sharing network, and they are good at moving information around, particularly when it's value relevant. So this explains, I think, the role of investors in this process, why it's not going to go away, and why we're all going to be somewhat dissatisfied with the results, probably for as long as I'm around at least. Final comment, there's a debate that has been around since 1980 around the wisdom of long-term investing at both the firm level and the markets level. Proponents of long-term investing are very influential. Harvard Business Review runs a lot of articles about the importance of a long-term perspective. McKinsey, their latest, I'm sorry, I'll have to check my note on this title. It was a good title. McKinsey says the investors you want disdain short-termism. So that is their 2023 advice on this, but they write consistently on it. I think it's important to be very careful, follow John Updike's advice. Be careful of that feeling of being wonderfully right. We're long-term investors. Stephen Kaplan at the University of Chicago wrote a thoughtful 2017 rejoinder arguing that, well, the short term matters too. The chess master Tartakower said, before the end game, the gods have placed the middle game. So while we're thinking about the long term, and in climate, there's really no other way to think. Climate is going to play out over generations. We have to think about what's happening in between, and that's where the greatest challenges lie. That is a deep and complex conversation that fires up from time to time and goes away. Climate, I think, transforms that conversation from an interesting academic conversation to one around the practical matter of survival. So I'd encourage you to think hard about where that one is going as well. Thank you very much for the time to make these comments.
Thank you. Thanks, Lloyd. So Marco's looking at his watch. I'm sure other people are as well. So we are past our time, but Xintong, and just any final thoughts before I close the session?
Yeah, I just want to thank Miguel as well as Lloyd for your wonderful comments. There are a lot of things to do and to think about. Yeah, we will try our best. And finally, I want to talk about, yes, engagement is going to be challenging, but we are not going to shy away from it. We academics are trying to think about measures, but we rely on you guys to really make the changes. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can I have the next slide just quickly? So final advertisement is to join the academic network. Be part of the conversation. There's, events like this. There's webinars which run through the year. There's a blog. There's the sharing of the data as well, and a platform for doing that, sharing of codes and so forth. So encourage you to become members. And the very last slide, please, would be that program I just mentioned that runs through the year. So it's just not in person. All you need to do is to join us virtually for this webinar series. So thanks, everyone. And I encourage everyone that had questions. So today was a great example of foreign and domestic, like different investors playing a role. So if you are interested in topics, please come engage with the speakers and the discussions. Thanks, everyone, for a great session. And I hope to see you for the next one coming up soon.